A brief introduction to arguments. When we hear the word argument, we often associate it with something like a yelling or screaming or fight we might have with friends or family members. But when we talk about arguments in philosophy, what we're talking about is really good reasoning. So, since philosophy depends on, as we've heard in our previous section, the idea of rational arguments or evidence that leads to certain conclusions, we want to know what makes for good evidence, good reasons, good conclusions, how we can get from certain premises or assumptions to a conclusion that's going to hold up under rational scrutiny. So when we talk about arguments here, we're really talking about something much more formal than we're used to in everyday life. So what this chapter hopes to do is show you what makes for a good argument and also what makes for a bad argument. So we'll be looking at sort of argument forms or what we call fallacies that might hinder our reasoning when we're talking about certain issues. So this chapter, while applicable to philosophy, is actually applicable to our everyday life, just how we make arguments, how we interpret arguments from others, and whether an argument is good or bad. So what specifically is an argument? Well, an argument is any sequence of statements intended to establish or at least make plausible some particular claim. So a sequence of statements, the premises of an argument, that are supposed to establish some particular conclusion. Now there are going to be, as we'll talk, different types of arguments, and some arguments are such that the premises make the conclusion likely, but not 100% assured. Other arguments guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So if the premises are true, then the conclusion will be true as well. But very generally, an argument is just statements or a sequence of statements that are supposed to establish some particular claim. So when we're talking about an argument leading from certain premises to a particular conclusion, the really important part is this middle. How do we get from the premises to the conclusion? And whatever happens in this middle component, so once we've got certain premises, then we say, does this conclusion follow? Well, how do we know if that conclusion follows? What are the steps in between? The given of certain premises, certain reasons, and how are we certain that they actually lead to this conclusion, or at least make that conclusion plausible? And this is where we get into the different types of argument forms and just how certain those arguments can be. So as I've already mentioned, there are two main types of arguments. And these arguments are deductive arguments and inductive arguments. And we're going to look at both types of arguments, as both types of arguments play a role both in philosophy and in our everyday reasoning. So the first type of argument, as I've already mentioned, is the deductive argument. Now, a deductive argument is one in which the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. In other words, if the premises are true, a deductive argument, that is a valid deductive argument, guarantees that the conclusion follows with 100% certainty. And it's actually the structure of the argument that determines validity. So if these premises are true, then this conclusion will be true as well, is a valid deductive argument. Another way of saying is that an argument that's valid is one in which it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Now, if this doesn't make sense right now, I'm going to show you a few examples that hopefully will clarify this. But what we want to sort of emphasize with the deductive argument is that when we say a deductive argument is valid, it means the conclusion is guaranteed to be true if the premises are true as well. So it's impossible for premise 1, 2, and 3, say, in an example, to be true and the conclusion to end up false if it's a valid argument. So let's take an example of a deductive argument. So a flat earth argument, and this is an argument those who sort of endorse this argument shall remain nameless, picture aside. Premise 1, the earth is flat. So let's assume that premise 1 is true, the earth is flat. If the earth is flat, then people, ships, cars, and that would fall off the edge. Okay, so that seems reasonable. If we have a flat earth, and if the earth is flat, then there's an edge to it. Ships, cars, and other things would fall off that edge. It's false or absurd that people fall off the edge of the earth. Therefore, what can we conclude? Well, assuming all of these are true, it seems that we've got the conclusion that therefore the earth can't be flat. Now, what in this case we end up with is sort of an absurdity, a contradiction. But ultimately, that conclusion follows from those premises. Let's take a look at another example. Suppose I made the following argument. I will have Chinese or I'll have Italian for dinner. So let's say I come to you on a Monday and say, I'm going to have Chinese or Italian for dinner. And I see you the next day on Tuesday. And you say, what did you have for dinner? And I said, well, I did not have Italian for dinner. Now, assuming that I didn't lie to you at any point, so assuming that my first statement, I will have Chinese or Italian, is true. In other words, I didn't end up going out for Greek or Middle Eastern food or something else. So assuming I didn't lie and it was either one or the other, I will have Chinese or Italian, and then I come in the next day and say, well, I didn't have Italian, what else could you possibly conclude? Other than, I had Chinese for dinner, right? So in this case, this is a valid deductive argument. Because the truth of the premise is, if one is true, if I have one or the other, and I didn't have one, then I must have had the other. And this form of an argument is what we call a disjunctive syllogism. So it really doesn't matter what the premises are. It doesn't matter what the or statement is. So in this case, what's important here is I have two things. I'm going to do this thing, or I'm going to do this thing, right? I'm going to have Chinese or I'm going to have Italian. It's not the case that I had Italian, therefore it's the case that I had this thing, Chinese. Now I could use this sort of same argument form with other examples. So for example, if I'm meeting you after class and I say, well, I'm going either to my office or over to the library. Now, assuming I can't be in two places at one time. So it's going to be one or the other. Either I'm going to my office or I'm going to the library. And then I say, but I'm not going to the library. Where can you logically assume I'm going to be? Well, I'm going to be in my office, right? So we can symbolize this using our fancy, if we use sort of fancy logic notation, the little wedge, the V here is an or. It's P or Q. If it's not the case that P, then it must be the case that Q, and vice versa. So I could be P or Q, not Q, therefore P. But either way, whenever you have an or statement in which one of the sides, the left or right side of the or statement, is not the case, then the other thing must be the case. So I'm going to my office or I'm going to the moon. I didn't go to my office, therefore it follows that I went to the moon. Now again, notice that while an example like that sounds absurd, it's a logically valid argument. It's an argument in which if it were true that I was going to my office or I was going to the moon, so assume that's true. It doesn't actually have to be true. It's just the assumption that it's true. And I didn't go to my office, so in none of these cases I've lied to you. It's true I'm going to go to the moon or to my office. It's true I didn't go to my office. Therefore, logically speaking, I went to the moon. Now, if this sounds kind of silly, in one sense, it is. In the other, we need another component. So what makes it silly is the fact that the argument is not sound. A sound argument is one in which premises are true and it's a valid argument. But in a case where it's unsound, that means that there's something in the premises that isn't in fact true, right? So we assume the truth of the premises, but what happens in reality, it might be, well, that's not true in reality. If it were true, this would follow. But that's actually not the case because this isn't true in reality. So there's a difference between validity and soundness. Now, we also use these types of arguments, deductive arguments, when we speculate about things, right? So economists, for example, might say, well, if interest rates go up, then it becomes more costly to borrow money. If it becomes more costly to borrow money, then people are less likely to put an addition onto their home or expand their business. Therefore, if interest rates go up, there will be less economic activity or there will be less construction. Now, it might be the case that that is a valid argument, right? It might be, oh, well, if interest rates go up, if I assume that interest rates go up, that people borrow less. If that's true, then these things seem to follow. On the other hand, it might be the case then in fact, when interest rates go up, people don't stop borrowing. So it might be interest rates go up, but if there's a whole bunch of economic activity and people are spending a lot of money anyway, that businesses will still borrow the money and construction will go up or expansion will go up. So we do this in other realms. We say, well, if that were true, this would follow. But then we turn around and say, yeah, but is it in fact true? Is that actually what happens? So valid arguments, we want to recognize that valid arguments are about the form of the argument, as we've seen here. It's simply the or statement, in this particular example, and that we do use them in all different kinds of fields, right? We make assumptions and we say, well, if this were true, what would logically follow? Then we have to go back and ask, does it in fact happen, or does this in fact follow? Are these premises in fact true? So let's look at another example. Imagine I made the following argument. If God is omnipotent and perfectly good, then no evil would exist. So if God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and perfectly good, then no evil would exist. It is the case that evil exists. Therefore, God is not omnipotent or God is not perfectly good. So we can ask ourselves, is this a valid argument? In other words, if the premises are true, does this conclusion follow? So if it were true that God being omnipotent and perfectly good, if that's the case, then there wouldn't be any evil. After all, if God is all-powerful, then God has the power to get rid of evil. And if God is perfectly good, then presumably a perfectly good being would want to get rid of bad things, evil. So that seems, if we assume that's true, and if we assume that evil exists, then it seems that the only thing that follows is that God is either not omnipotent or God is not perfectly good. This is what we discuss in philosophy or religion as the problem of evil, right? If you have an all-powerful God and an all-good God, how can there be evil in the world? So this is the argument that one might make to say that either God isn't all-powerful or that God isn't all-good. So let's look at now the sort of symbolic form of this. So if I symbolize the argument, O and G, for omnipotent and good, so premise one is God is omnipotent and God is all good, then evil shouldn't exist, or there is no evil. There is evil, so premise two. Therefore, it's not the case that God is omnipotent and good, so not O and G, which is the same thing as saying not O or not G. God is not omnipotent or God is not good. So these two, actually in logic, these are equivalent statements. Now, while this example deals with the problem of evil, about God, omnipotence, and the existence of evil, the form of the argument can apply to a number of different things. So this is actually a generalized form of what we call a modus tollens argument. And modus tollens simply says this: if P then Q, so P and Q can be any premise, right? In this case, in this argument, it was O and G is a compound statement. But if O and G then Q, it's not the case that Q, therefore, it's not the case that P. This is the general form. So if you take a course in deductive logic, what you would learn to do is take arguments and translate them into these basic forms, and then come up with conclusions that you can say are either valid or invalid. So if I said something like, if you study, then you will pass the class, it's not the case that you passed the class. Therefore, it must be not the case that you studied. Right? And this follows exactly the same form. If you study, so if P equals you study, so if you study, then you'll pass the class. If it's then the case that you didn't pass, right? So premise two is you didn't pass. Well, then what can we conclude? Well, you didn't study. So these three dots mean therefore you didn't study. So notice it's exactly the same form of the argument, right? You have an if statement that you assume. Now again, you assume that statement to be true. If you study, then you'll pass the class. Well, how could that be not a sound argument? Well, it might be that what you define as studying really isn't studying. So if you put your book under your pillow and hope for knowledge through osmosis, that it's going to leak into your brain, and that's what you call studying, well, then clearly this argument is going to be false. We might say, if you study, then you'll pass the class. If you didn't pass, what else could logically be the conclusion but the fact that you didn't study? Right? Assuming the premises are true. So this is true of all deductive arguments. When we study logic, formal logic, we learn to sort of translate English sentences into symbolic form and then apply these forms to them. There's a predefined set of logical forms, sort of basic rules in logic. But this gives you an example that in deductive arguments, if the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. There's just nothing else that can follow given the truth of those premises. Now again, not all arguments that we make are deductive, and there are other types of arguments that don't have this kind of certainty, and that's the types of arguments we're going to talk about next. Unlike deductive arguments, the truth of the premises of inductive arguments do not guarantee the truth of their conclusion. So the truth of the premises of an inductive argument only make the conclusion highly likely. And there are several different types of inductive arguments, and those are what we're going to look at now. So the first type of inductive argument is called an inductive generalization. An inductive generalization is an argument in which we draw a conclusion about a group of things based on an observation of a part of that group. So an inductive generalization says that if X% of an observed F's have some property G, then therefore that same percent of all F's are going to have that property G. So let's imagine I wanted to determine amongst all ice cream eaters how many of those people like chocolate ice cream. So let's say I sampled 1,000 people, 1,000 ice cream eaters, and I asked them, of those 1,000, how many like chocolate? Doesn't have to be their favorite, but how many actually like chocolate? And so out of the 1,000 people that I surveyed, 750 came back and said they like chocolate ice cream. So 75% of observed ice cream eaters like chocolate. I could then say, if I'm using an inductive generalization, 75% of all ice cream eaters like chocolate ice cream. Now, is it actually the case? Can I say with 100% certainty that 75% of all ice cream eaters like chocolate ice cream? Well, it makes it highly probable. If I took a random sampling of 1,000 ice cream eaters and it turns out 750 have on their list as chocolate as one of their favorites or one of the types of ice cream they like, then I could be pretty sure that 75% of all ice cream eaters like chocolate. But it's also possible that that sampling might have been tilted in one way or the other. Let's say I went to Hershey, Pennsylvania, where there are a lot more chocolate eaters, for example. Now, I don't know if that's actually true, but it could be that there are more people there that actually like chocolate, and so my numbers might actually be a little skewed. But if I did a truly random sample, if I sampled people all across the country from all different kinds of backgrounds and so forth, and I said, of you 1,000 people that I randomly sampled, 750 of you like chocolate, then I can be pretty confident that my conclusion is true. But notice it's not 100% true. It's not like the I'm going to have Chinese or I'm going to have Italian for dinner, right? It's not like that kind of certainty, because in that case, if I'm telling you the truth, if it's one or the other, and it's not one, say it's not Chinese, then it must have been Italian. That's 100% certain. In a inductive generalization, the fact that a certain percentage of things has observed things have a particular property, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the entire population is going to have that particular characteristic. It just makes it much, much more likely. So you can see where an inductive generalization can go really wrong. So imagine I gave you this other sort of hypothetical case. Imagine that I actually did a survey, I did a study, and I found that 95% of people that ate French fries and pizza on a daily basis were actually in excellent shape. So 95% of the people that I studied who ate French fries and pizza on a daily basis, maybe one or the other, or even both, it turns out that those individuals were in excellent health. In other words, when I looked at things like cholesterol and body weight and all those other things and all the other things, I did sugar tests for diabetes and things. It turns out that 95% of these observed people were really in excellent health. And therefore I conclude, so this is my study group, right? The observed group. I observe this group and I say 95% of them were in excellent health, even though they ate pizza and French fries every day. Then I say, well, what am I going to conclude from that? 95% of all people that eat pizza and French fries on a daily basis are in excellent health. Now, if you look at that and say, that just doesn't seem right. That seems wrong in some way. Well, then you'd be exactly right, because what are we noting? Well, if it turns out that the people I actually studied were all athletes, then that might very well be the case. So many athletes will burn vast amounts of calories every day. So I know from people I knew in high school that were on swim teams that the amount of calories they burnt was so high that they could pretty much eat anything they wanted. Right? And that wasn't going to affect their health because they were burning so many calories, training in the morning, training in the afternoon, and the amount of physical exertion that they were doing would burn off whatever that was. In fact, in some cases, they needed more calories. Now, if somebody who works in an office, who has a more sedentary lifestyle, right, who isn't up and running, who's working, who's sitting a lot of the day, if they ate pizza and French fries every day, odds are that's not going to be good for their health when it comes to cholesterol and diabetes and all those sorts of things. So that conclusion is highly unlikely. Why? Mainly because of the test subjects, right? When I only studied athletes, so if the only people I observed were athletes and their dietary habits, and then said, well, these people are eating this every day, and it turns out that they're doing just fine. Well, yeah, that's a generalization I can make for high-impact sports maybe, but I definitely couldn't make a general statement about the overall population, whether this is a good diet for people to have, for example. So you can see that it's very easy for an inductive generalization to go wrong if the group that's being studied isn't representative of all individuals. And we find these problems in other types of studies. For example, drug trials often do not include children. And so how a drug is going to interact with children is much different than how it interacts with adults. So if a drug is found safe in adults, then can we assume that it's safe in children because 99.9% of all adults who took this medication, of the study group found it effective and safe? Does that mean all people will find it effective and safe? Well, that's not the case. In fact, there are distinct differences between individuals, children, and indeed between men and women that can change the efficacy of a particular drug. So an inductive generalization is a way of coming to a conclusion, to be sort of certain about a conclusion. It might be very certain, provided that you have a representative sampling when you're making these sorts of arguments. Another type of inductive argument is the argument from analogy. And an argument from analogy makes a comparison between two things in order to make a conclusion or to draw a conclusion based on their similarities. So if I have some object A and another object B, and they are alike in having certain features, so in this case we say F, G, and H. So these two objects have these three similarities, and then I look at object B, and it turns out not only does it have F, G, and H, but it also has some other property, X. Therefore, what can I conclude if I'm making an argument from analogy? Well, then I can conclude that object A also has that feature. So when we do an argument from analogy, we take two things and we put those two things side by side and say they share all of these features, features 1, 2, and 3, F, G, and H, whatever it is. And if I look at B and say, oh, but B also has this additional thing, well, then I can conclude that A also has that feature. Now, arguments from analogy can work, provided that the two things are very, very similar in a number of different respects. So the closer two things are to being the same, then the closer or the more likely it is that they're going to have the given feature that we're looking at. So in this case, we have A and B has this extra feature. A is going to have it as well. But as we'll see, arguments from analogy aren't always that certain. And in fact, the similarities between objects is extremely important when you're comparing two things or using this type of argument. So imagine I wanted to make the following argument by analogy. Let's say that I wanted to compare healthcare to any other commodity or service, right? So the analogy I want to draw is one between healthcare and, say, auto repair, right? And the argument I want to make is that healthcare is a commodity or a service just like automotive repair is a service. So I look at the two and I say, well, when we're talking about healthcare, there's something wrong with the individual, right? So when you go to see a doctor, it's because you have some ailment, assuming, right? So it's not just your everyday checkup, you have some problem, there's something wrong, there's something that needs to be fixed. Similarly, when you go to get your car repaired, it's because there's something wrong with the car and it needs to get fixed, right? So in both cases, they're similar in that regard. In both cases, we need some sort of specialist, right? So if I go to my doctor or whether I go to an auto repair place, in either case, I'm looking for somebody who knows what they're doing. It's something that I can't do myself. So maybe I can change my oil, but I actually don't know how to fix my own brakes or something like that. Similarly, I can take care of my body. I can exercise, or I could take vitamins, or I could take some Tylenol if I have a headache. But presumably, what I need now is somebody who knows more than that. So I go for a specialist. It's also the case that there are many providers, right? So both in healthcare, there are a number of different hospitals I can go to. So if I'm in the Cleveland area, I can go to the Cleveland Clinic, or I can go to University Hospital. There's choices for me to make. And similarly, there are many providers when it comes to car repair. So it seems that these two things have a lot of similarities, right? So they're both individuals that we go to when there's some sort of problem or something we need fixing. They're both specialists in what they do. There are many different choices to go. I can go to Monroe to fix my car, or Firestone, or I can go to some independent garage and have them do the work. And so one might argue, well, if we treat automotive repair as a commodity, as a service that's out there in the market, right? Both of these are market. Both people get paid. Doctors get paid. People work on your car also get paid. And in fact, we could say, oh, and there's even insurance, right? So while there's health insurance, there's also car insurance. You can also buy that in case your car breaks, or you might be under warranty, and that might be a type of insurance that you have on your car. So given all these similarities, I now draw the conclusion that if automotive care is a commodity, is in the market, therefore healthcare should also be in the market. Right? And so that's an argument by analogy. Here are two things that share all these similarities, and it turns out that automotive care is a market-based service, then therefore healthcare too should be a market-based service. So this could be a counter argument, for example, to say, no, healthcare is a right. Now, if I wanted to make this argument, the question is just how strong is this argument by analogy, right? I'm drawing an analogy between auto repair and healthcare. Now, the critic of this type of argument might argue that no, in fact, these two things aren't actually that close together. So if you can say these two things are very close, then it would seem to follow my conclusion that, oh, healthcare should be a market-based sort of thing. But then someone might argue, well, wait a minute. is it actually true that healthcare and auto repair are that closely aligned with each other? So while it's true that there are many providers of automotive repair, it's also the case that I don't always have the luxury of choosing or shopping around for healthcare providers, right? So it's okay beforehand I get sick, but what happens in emergency situations? I don't have the luxury if I'm having a heart attack to say, well, I'd like to go get another evaluation. I'd like to have somebody else take a look at it. I'd like to get another estimate on what it's going to cost me. So is it really the case that having an emergency, a healthcare emergency, needing something fixed in your body is the same thing as needing something fixed on your car? The other disanalogy might be that while everyone needs healthcare at some point in their life, almost everyone is going to have to see a doctor, is going to be ill at some point, even as they get older, is going to have some sort of condition. It's not true that everybody has to have a car, right? So a car is a choice that I choose to buy a vehicle that will inevitably need some sort of repair or maintenance, whereas I don't have any choice when it comes to my body. I can choose to take the bus and not worry about repairs. I could choose to ride share with someone or ride a bike or do something else, whereas I can't actually choose whether or not to get sick, right? That's something that I don't have any control over. And it might be there's a difference, right? There might not be any right to have my car fixed, again, because it's a voluntary choice to have a car and to invest in that sort of mode of transportation, where some might argue, no, human beings are different than cars, right? You can neglect a car, you can allow a car to fall into disrepair in a way that allowing people to fall in disrepair might be morally repugnant in some way. So notice that when you make these analogies, when you start to say that healthcare is just like auto repair, and you're making this analogy, you got to be sure that the two things are actually that close. So this is a case where this might not be a particularly good argument if you're on the side of healthcare as a commodity, because drawing those things leaves out certain fundamentally important differences between the two things that are being compared or being used as a comparison in making the argument. The next argument I'll look at is the argument to the best explanation. And this is also referred to as an abductive argument or abduction. And the argument to the best explanation basically is the type of argument we see with detective shows or when we're reading a mystery. So we've got some phenomenon P, and we offer a hypothesis to explain P. So hypothesis B explains this phenomenon. So if we think of this in terms of a mystery, we can look and say, okay, here is the murder victim. And now I say the hypothesis B, who did it, best explains this. Now, how do I do that? Well, I look at all the various pieces of information, right? I look at all the different evidence, and then I say, given all this evidence, I come up with a hypothesis B that explains the whodunit, who the killer is, and no other hypothesis explains P as well as B. So when you see, for example, police shows where they've got a list of suspects, and they say, okay, well, given these suspects, what do we have? What other information do we have? Well, where they were. Do they have an alibi? How likely it is that they had the means and the motive and the opportunity. And so you look at all of these things and you say, you come up with a hypothesis that explains all the facts. Well, the person was found here at this time, this weapon was used, and so forth. And then you try to match that up to an explanation. And no other hypothesis, once we come up with B, better explains all of this evidence, all of this information. Therefore, it's probable that B is true. So an abductive argument is to take little pieces of information to draw a conclusion about some phenomenon that we want to describe. So as I said, this is something we often see in sort of in police type investigations, but it's also scientific investigations, right? We have some phenomenon we want to account for, light going through, whether light is a wave or a particle. And then we offer a hypothesis that explains how light seems to be acting differently in these two situations. We look at all other possible explanations, and then we come up with some sort of conclusion about how light operates or how gravity operates or something else in the sciences. So as I said, when we look at detective shows, they're probably the best sort of example of an abductive argument that we see in everyday life. So whether you're watching Monk or Sherlock Holmes, or Agatha Christie, a Miss Marple, or a Columbo. All of these types of shows, the main investigator is acting or is using abduction. So although oftentimes people attribute deductive arguments to something like Sherlock Holmes or even an inductive argument, it's really an abductive argument, because we're going from bits and pieces of evidence that are gathered, and we use that evidence to explain some outcome or some phenomenon. All right, so evidence leads, there's the evidence, we have a phenomenon, we have evidence that seems to explain that, right? We put it all together into an explanation. X is the killer. Light is both a wave and a particle, whatever it is that we're looking at. And then we look at all the other possible explanations and come to the conclusion that this is the one that best explains all of the evidence, all of the facts. The final inductive argument is the reductio ad absurdum. And this argument is one in which we start with the assumption that a proposition is true. So we start with a premise, assume this is true. If that thing is true, whatever it is we assume, then something else, Q, would also have to be true. However, Q is absurd, it can't possibly be true, therefore the initial thing that we assumed must not be the case. Now the argument we gave early on, the flat earth example, is actually a reductio sort of argument. So a reductio argument can be used with deductive premises, right? I can assume certain premises are true and then see where that leads deductively using my rules of inference and things in formal sort of logic, in a formal sort of logical setting. But it's also the case that I can use a reductio argument that isn't a deductively valid argument. In other words, when I suppose some proposition is true, and if something is true, then it leads to something else, Q, would also have to be true, but Q is absurd. Now, it might just be the case that, especially when we're talking about scientific reasoning, that something that we thought was absurd really isn't absurd. And this is why it's also an inductive argument. So reductio can be used in deductive logic in a very specific way to show that a contradiction comes about. But also when we're talking about an inductive argument, when we make an assumption that some proposition is true and it leads to something that we find ridiculous, that doesn't necessarily mean that the ridiculous thing is in fact false, right? So reductio argument, this is what makes it inductive. It's probably the case that this is false, that the proposition P that we were proposing is false. But there's not a 100% guarantee that the conclusion is true. So reductio arguments really are this argument to absurdity. That's what it actually means, reduction to the absurd. We sometimes see this in ethics, that we have someone propose a principle in ethics or a position in ethics. And through a series of reasoning steps, let's say somebody proposes some sort of idea, and the end result of that idea, that principle that's proposed, is something like slavery is okay, or eating babies for breakfast is okay. If that's actually the result of accepting some principle as true, we might say, no, this reduces to an absurd conclusion. If that's okay, then this would be okay as well. And because this would be okay, this thing is so absurd, we have to reject that initial principle. So you often see reductio arguments in ethics when people argue that accepting this position leads to these consequences. Now, it might just be the case that we're really wrong. Maybe it is the case that something like eating babies for breakfast, as horrible as that sounds, is okay, morally speaking. But we're usually pretty sure that if a principle leads to that sort of outcome, that that's a bad principle in some way. And that's what a reductio argument does. It starts with some assertion that leads to some crazy sort of outcome, that we just say this is a ridiculous outcome, therefore that thing we assumed at the beginning must be wrong. And so that's how we'll often see, especially when we get to sort of questions of ethics or social political philosophy, oftentimes you'll see these sort of reductio arguments where people will say, here's what's wrong with that person's position, because if you accept their position on that, then that leads to, consequently, the idea that this is also acceptable. And whatever that is might be so morally abhorrent to us that we have to say the original assumption was just wrong. In addition to deductive arguments and inductive arguments, there's a sort of third category of reasoning that it's helpful to understand, and these are what we term the informal fallacies. Now, what informal fallacies are common bad ways of reasoning. In other words, these are common errors in reasoning that we see so often that we've actually given names to several of these types of arguments. And so what I want to do now is simply go over some of these various informal fallacies. And some of these you're probably familiar with, you may have seen before. You might not have even known that they actually had a formal name. The other thing we should note about informal fallacies is that they're not always bad reasoning. Sometimes what might count in one situation as a fallacy might actually be perfectly appropriate reasoning. So I'll talk about that as I go through the different fallacies, but I just want to highlight some. There are several informal fallacies. Many people have given names to a number of these. I just wanted to sort of highlight some of the important ones, some of the major ones that we often see, particularly ones that we may actually see while we're talking about various topics in philosophy. So the first fallacy is begging the question, and this is often referred to also as circular reasoning. And what happens in a question where we're begging the question is that the conclusion is actually assumed in the premises. Right? So if you have an argument in which the conclusion is contained in the premise, you've engaged in circular reasoning or begging the question. Now, you'll note that the term begging the question or begs the question is often referred or is often used when someone says, well, that implies or that calls us to ask the second question. That's actually an inappropriate or mistaken use of the term begging the question. To beg the question is to engage in circular reasoning. So here's an example of the circular reasoning or begging the question. Let's say you start with the following. You should believe God exists because the Bible says so. And then someone says, well, why should I believe the Bible? And says, you should believe the Bible because God wrote it. But notice that when you give this type of argument, you should believe God exists because the Bible says so. When you then ask, well, why should one believe the Bible? And you say, well, because God wrote it. But isn't that just begging the question? Isn't the whole point to prove that God exists? But if you assume God exists when God wrote the Bible, then there is no conclusion you're drawing, right? You are simply stating the conclusion in the premises. So the conclusion God exists can't be derived. You can't say that you've proven God exists by assuming that God exists, right? And so this, when you have examples of this, when the conclusion is contained in the premise, then you are engaged in the logical fallacy of begging the question or circular reasoning. The next logical fallacy is the ad hominem. An ad hominem attack is when you attack the person rather than attacking their argument. And this is one of the most common sorts of logical fallacies. We see this all the time. We see it particularly in politics, when people go after the person rather than going after the person's idea. So anytime you see someone offering up some sort of proposal or some idea or some conclusion, and they attack a person's argument by simply going after, say, their character, then you're engaged in an ad hominem fallacy. So take the following example. Josh Duggar, I don't know if you all remember the Duggars and the large family, and they were a large conservative sort of family, believed in traditional values. And it turns out a few years ago that Josh Duggar argued that's for supporting traditional values. Right, so he came out and he was giving speeches at various places for traditional values. But then it turns out we find out that he's cheated on his wife and he's actually molested his own family members. And let's say that we make the argument Josh Duggar argues for supporting traditional values, but then he cheats on his wife and molests family members. Therefore, we shouldn't support traditional values. Now, we might think that this individual is a terrible individual, that they're a hypocrite, that they didn't believe what they actually said, that they're morally reprehensible, that they should be in jail, whatever. All that might be true. But notice that really isn't a response to the argument that we shouldn't support traditional values. Right? So if you're saying that traditional values, if you attack traditional values as being bad, if you say, here's reasons why we shouldn't support traditional values. Well, it doesn't reflect our current society. It was unfair to women. It was unfair to children. It doesn't treat people equally, those values. That's one thing. So that's one type of argument. You go after whether or not you think traditional, quote unquote, whatever that means, values are. You can have arguments for or against that. But if your argument against traditional values is to go after the character of Josh Duggar, then you haven't actually made an argument. You've attacked the person, but you haven't attacked their arguments, right? And that goes for anyone. So if someone puts up there, oh, Bernie Sanders believes that there should be health care for all. Okay, yes, but Bernie Sanders is a socialist, and he's never worked a day in his life, and we don't believe him anyway, and he's cheated on his taxes or something like that, right? You bring up all these arguments against Bernie Sanders in some way. That doesn't actually address whether or not we should have health care for all, right? When you're attacking the person but not attacking their position, that's when you're engaged in an ad hominem. So how would I avoid an ad hominem argument? In that case, I might say something like, well, it's not economically feasible, or we don't have the money, or it would require huge amounts of taxation such that people would be made worse off than if we hadn't done that. Now, whether or not you like those arguments or whether that's a good argument is a whole separate issue. But notice I'm not going after the person now. I'm going after the idea that that person is making. So good reasoning avoids ad hominem attacks. Straw man argument, or the straw man fallacy. The straw man fallacy is one that we see all the time. And this is apparent in media, this is apparent in politics and elsewhere. What the straw man argument says, or does, is create a fictional position and then tears that position down. So it's a misrepresentation of a person's argument so that it's easier to criticize that argument. And there are a number of examples of straw man arguments, right? So it's easy to knock down a position when you misrepresent or you make an absurd claim that no one actually makes. So oftentimes a straw man argument is not just to misrepresent someone's argument, but it's to make up an opponent that doesn't actually exist, to make up an opponent who actually doesn't hold that position. There is no person that holds a position, and then attempt to knock down that position, which is very easy, of course, when you make up a really crazy or absurd position that no one actually holds. So let's look at a couple of examples. So two examples that I've actually seen is one goes something like this. The NRA supports the right to bear arms, so they support private ownership of nuclear weapons. Now, you may not like the NRA, and you may not like what the NRA stands for, but just because the NRA supports the right to bear arms doesn't in any way entail that they support the right for the ownership of nuclear weapons. In fact, the question is, who in the NRA has ever said, oh, well, the right to bear arms also includes the right to own a nuclear weapon? So this is a straw man. If there's nobody that actually holds that view, then to attack the NRA's views on gun ownership based on the idea that they also endorse the ownership of nuclear weapons is to commit a straw man fallacy. Right? Now, this would be different if somebody actually said that they support that. So if the NRA came out with a statement and said the right to bear arms includes all arms and all arms includes nuclear weapons, then that would be a legitimate criticism to say that, oh, well, their right to bear arms, now I have to attack that argument. Why is that a good or bad argument? But if I say, well, because they support one thing, I imply that they support another, and there's no one who's made that statement, there's no NRA member who's made that statement, or the organization hasn't made it, then that would be committing a straw man fallacy. Similarly, an argument that heard, people who believe two men or two women should be allowed to marry also believe you should be able to marry your sibling or your pet. Now, who actually has held the position that you should be able to marry a sibling or a pet? Right? Is this the standard view? So when we're talking in the context of same-sex marriage, the argument against same-sex marriage is, well, those people not only do that, but with same-sex marriage, those people also believe you should be marrying your pets and your siblings and other things. Well, did anyone ever actually hold that position? Is it actually true that there's somebody out there not only advocating for same-sex marriage, but for all marriage to anything or anyone you want? Well, that's a straw man. Unless you know somebody who actually holds that position, then to sort of make up a position or misrepresent a position and then knock it down would be very easy. Of course, if same-sex marriage entailed that, siblings would have to marry and you could marry your pet, that those things were the same, and that was the position, then that's easy to defeat. Of course, animals can't consent to being married. And of course, marriage of siblings has all kinds of moral and other implications that would be objectionable. But does anyone really hold that position? Is that really the position for those who were for same-sex marriage? Well, it seems kind of ridiculous. In fact, it is, and that's why we would call it a straw man argument. No one holds that position. You've simply made that up in order to make it easier to attack their argument or their position. And again, that's the straw man fallacy. The final fallacy I want to look at is the argument from ignorance. This is an argument which you do sometimes see. It's a subtle argument at times. Other times, it seems obviously just a bad argument. The argument from ignorance goes something like this. It's an argument that says a lack of evidence for something is evidence that it is false, or the lack of evidence of something against something is evidence for its truth. So in other words, I have no evidence for it, therefore it must be false. I have no evidence for it, therefore it must be true. So someone says, I believe in God, and you can't prove that there isn't. There's no evidence that there isn't a God, therefore there must be a God. Well, no, that's not actually an argument, right? The lack of evidence for it doesn't mean, or the lack of evidence against there being a God doesn't mean there is a God. Similarly, the lack of evidence for there being a God doesn't mean there's a God, right? So the idea that when you make an argument without information, from a lack of evidence, you draw a conclusion based on the lack of evidence, that you're actually engaged in an argument from ignorance. So, as an example, as I just meant, you can't prove that God doesn't exist, therefore God must exist. So if someone comes and says, I want evidence, you say you don't believe in God, give me the evidence. Oh, you can't give me evidence that God doesn't exist, therefore God must exist. Well, again, that's an argument from ignorance. Right? Because I don't have any evidence one way or the other. If anything, the sort of correct position would be to suspend belief, right? If I don't have evidence for something, if I don't have evidence against something, then the only position I can take is sort of a position of neutrality, right? I don't have evidence one way or the other, so therefore I can't tell you with certainty one way or the other. There is no proof that the parapsychology experiments were fraudulent, so I'm sure they weren't. So if we're talking about parapsychology, telekinesis, or mind reading, or whatever sort of parapsychology experiment we're talking about, there's no proof that the parapsychology experiments were fraudulent, so I'm sure there weren't. Well, notice this is an argument from ignorance. Well, I have no evidence that they weren't a sham, that they weren't, trying to pull the wool over our eyes about this and make it appear that these sorts of things exist. Therefore, they must not have been. Now, it might be that there was nothing wrong with these parapsychology experiments. People who have done experiments for years on whether or not we have these sort of mental powers. But if there's no evidence for saying that it was a good experiment, no argument against it being a good experiment, then I have to suspend judgment. In other words, I need more evidence. So the lack of evidence, an argument from ignorance, doesn't support this sort of conclusion. Since there's no proof that they weren't fraudulent, I'm guessing they weren't. You would need more than that. So for example, how would I make an argument against these experiments? I would look and say, you can see here are all the problems with this experiment. It wasn't double blind. The participants were able to see things. The researchers made faces when they were, sort of faces that indicated that they were on the wrong track or something like that. And you can say, here's all the problems with that experiment. Therefore, this experiment was fraudulent or this experiment was bad. On the other hand, if I went and looked at this and said, wow, these are some surprising results. People were actually able to predict what was on the card that somebody held up. And in fact, they didn't see the person and there were no sort of visual cues from the experimenters or the researchers because they were behind some sort of, screen and they couldn't be seen. Those, in that case, I would now have reason for a particular conclusion. But an argument from ignorance is one in which you say that a conclusion is true because of or based on a lack of evidence, either in one form or another, right? Positively or negatively, depending on which case it is.